When was the last time a Democratic presidential candidate won the states of Indiana, Iowa, Kansas, North Dakota, or South Dakota? It's a stark reminder of the shifting political landscape in America's heartland. America is so far removed from when William Jennings Bryan carried the state of Nebraska in 1896, or in 1964 when President Lyndon B. Johnson carried both North and South Dakota, or even in 2008 when Senator Barack Obama carried the state of Indiana, and in 2012 when then President Barack Obama carried the state of Iowa. Tonight, we're tackling this fascinating and pivotal shift. We embark on a journey through the predominantly white post-industrial cities that have undergone a seismic political shift over the past several decades. Once bastions of the Democratic New Deal coalition, these cities have flipped to red, fueling the rise of Republican presidents from Reagan to Trump. Our guest tonight, Professor Stephanie Ternullo, a professor of government at Harvard University, offers a compelling narrative in her book, How the Heartland Went Red. She argues that to understand this rightward shift, we must appreciate the profound impact of place. Local conditions, how residents perceive their challenges and opportunities, shape their political identities in powerful ways. Democrats are facing a joyless and exhausting grind through the 2024 election, with anxiety morphing into palpable trepidation. President Joe Biden's reelection prospects look increasingly shaky, and the gap between public optimism and private dread among party leaders has never been wider. Despite everything, Trump is running ahead of Biden in most battleground states, raising more money and stirring up fears about the very future of our democracy. Through a comparative study of 3 blue-collar Midwestern states, Harvard University's Professor Stephanie Ternullo reveals the nuanced place-based factors that have accelerated or decelerated the shift to the right. With meticulous research and extensive interviews, she paints a vivid picture of how local leaders and contexts frame political perceptions. Join us tonight as we unpack these insights with Professor Ternullo and explore how the Heartland's journey from blue to red offers critical lessons for the future of American politics. Professor Ternullo, it's a pleasure and honor to have you on the Political Mic tonight. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So, Professor, could you elaborate on the historical context of the Democratic New Deal coalition in the Midwest and how these regions became pivotal in American electoral politics?
Yeah, sure. So the New Deal coalition is often kind of the implicit reference point we have in our minds when we talk about what it would look like to have a sort of working class politics in the US. That was the historical moment when we came closest to having something that looked like a working class politics in the US. And a lot of FDR support was in the solidly Democratic South, but also sort of a new coalitions of support in sort of industrialized Northern and Midwestern cities, right? And so he brought in new immigrant groups, young voters, and union members for the first time into this kind of growing Democratic Party coalition. And that sort of sustained his 4 terms in office and sustained the Democratic coalition through the 1960s.
3 blue-collar Midwestern cities with differing political trajectories. Can you provide a detailed analysis of the local conditions in these cities and how they influenced their political shifts? And why did you choose these specific cities for your book?
Yeah. I'll start with your second question first. So going back to your previous question about the New Deal coalition. So I started this book with a question about sort of how the breakdown of the New Deal coalition from the 1960s onward was still shaping white working class politics today. And so I started by identifying all the places that could be considered kind of white, blue-collar communities that have been part of that New Deal coalition in the 1930s and 40s. And then there were 467 of those counties. And then I used their presidential vote share from 1964 onward and identified different clusters of voting trajectories from 1964 onward. So I found one cluster that kind of turned to the right in the late 1960s. That's right after the Civil Rights Movement. And then I found another cluster that was sort of remained competitive to Democrats up until 2016 and then turned kind of hard to the right. So it's the Trump's first election. And then I found a third cluster that still remained in the Democratic coalition all the way through 2016. And now this was just 4% of those original 467 counties fell into that third cluster. So really an outlier group. And so I was interested in these three different clusters because I wanted to understand kind of why similar kinds of people, why similar kinds of places would have responded differently to the same shifting political developments, right? So we have this historical narrative that tells us first that, the civil rights movement and the introduction of race in new ways into American politics, of course, it had always been there, but the civil rights movement broke it into electoral politics in new ways. That was kind of the first break in the white working class New Deal coalition, that white voters were then kind of torn between their race and class and voting for the Democrats and Republicans. And then we have this other story about sort of the rise of the religious right and its incorporation into the Republican Party, which further conflicts sort of white Christian working class voters, like which party am I going to go for, right? And so that sort of historical narrative suggests a kind of like even unfolding over time across these kinds of white working class New Deal communities, right? Like they should respond similarly to these national shifts. But with this analysis I did, I saw very clearly that these places hadn't responded similarly to these national shifts, that some had kind of abandoned the New Deal coalition right away after the civil rights movement. Others stuck through until the incorporation of the religious right. Others stuck through until the Trump era. And a very small handful were still sticking it out in the Democratic coalition through to today. And so to understand that kind of historical and contemporary variation, I chose one place from each of those groups. So the place that turned to the right after the civil rights movement was in Indiana. The place that turned to the right in 2016 was in Minnesota. And then the place that is still voting Democratic, that kind of outlier community, is in Wisconsin.
And one of the things that you do in your book is that you argue for the importance of place in understanding political shifts. What specific local conditions have you found to be the most influential in driving the rightward shift in these Midwestern cities?
Sure. You already asked me that, so I'm sorry I didn't answer before. But I'll answer this. I'm going to invert your question. So you said what's moving things to the right? Well, a lot of what I learned in the book about what's moving things to the right was from that case, that city that is still in the Democratic coalition, right? And so in that city, as I said, it's this outlier. And what's going on there is that they still have this kind of set of politically mobilized unions. And the unions are gathering together monthly to meet as part of a local labor council, which is really rare today. They're endorsing candidates for local office, which is also pretty rare today. And they're kind of reminding people that, as many people told me, this is a community that's built on the back of organized labor. And so the community wants to support organized labor, but also knows that the Democrats are not just the party of organized labor, but they're the party for people who are struggling, who need help. And that's sort of what they stand for. And that belief in the Democratic Party as the party to kind of help those in need, to help people who are struggling, that belief was missing in my other two cities. And so one of the core arguments of the book is that sort of set of local organizations, not just the existence of organized labor, but the fact that they remain so engaged in local politics, is central to what's keeping that city in the Democratic coalition, and is also central to explaining kind of why so much of the rest of the New Deal coalition went to the right, because organized labor has had so many hits, has taken so many hits over the past 60 years, 70 years.
Can you share some of the compelling examples from your research that illustrate how local conditions trump national narratives in shaping voter behavior in the Midwestern region?
Sure. So national narratives, a lot of times in political science, and I think sometimes in politics in general, we think that sort of like what politicians say is really important. And maybe it is, and it probably is in some way, shape, or form. But when I spent time talking to folks in these cities, and everyone I spoke to 4 times over the course of 18 months. So I got to know people, but I also got to hear how they were responding to not just the presidential campaign, the 2020 presidential campaign, but the COVID-19 pandemic, the closures that we all lived through, the openings that we all lived through, this sort of really turbulent time. And, people were tuning into CNN or MSNBC or Fox News for sure. But they were also listening to their mayors. And prior to the pandemic, they were listening to each other. They were on Facebook, all of these kinds of things. And so basically, like, their lived experiences in their communities has shaped and continues to shape a lot of their politics. And so I've already kind of talked about organized labor a bit in my Democratic cities. So I'll give you an example from my Republican field site in Indiana. So this is a place where everybody belongs to a church. And they don't just belong to a church, but they volunteer for their churches. They send their kids to Bible camp in the summer. It's a pretty intensive experience to be a church member in this community. And when you move to that town, it wouldn't be surprising for someone to ask you, like, which church are you going to, right? There's a social expectation that everybody is sort of intensive participant in church life in this community. What that means is that the churches in this town, unlike a lot of churches across the country, haven't suffered sort of massive membership declines. They've seen a little bit of decline, but not massive declines. And they also have a lot of financial resources because they have this really high quality of membership, right? So they have like a pool of financial and human capital that they gather together. And the churches kind of pool that financial and human capital across each other, along with other local nonprofits. And so when new social problems pop up in this town, and during the time I spent there, they were particularly concerned about hunger and homelessness. So when those kinds of social problems pop up, the churches and nonprofits, through existing mechanisms of coordination, they kind of just jump in and they try to resolve those problems, right? And regardless of whether they do resolve the problems, like, they aren't fixing homelessness in this community, but the people who volunteer to serve meals, the people who donate, the people who have friends who go to a church that's leading one of these efforts, they learn and are constantly hearing about the churches that are taking care of their problems. And so when it comes to thinking about how their community or how the country as a whole should go about kind of addressing these sorts of social needs like hunger, housing, other problems we might think of as related to economic precarity, this community really thinks, well, we should all do it this way. We should rely on churches and nonprofits. It works really well here. Again, regardless of whether it works objectively well, people really feel it works very well. And at the same time as they're seeing their churches and nonprofits taking all this action, they're not seeing the action from the federal government, although it's there in all these invisible ways, as other political scientists and sociologists have shown us. The federal government is there in all of our lives, helping support middle class and working class families alike. But we don't see it as much. And so this community really sort of feels that federal government intervention into things like social welfare programs is kind of unnecessary, because if everybody just, pooled together and chipped in to help each other out the way they should, then everybody would be helped out.
One of the characteristics of this early part of the 21st century is that we live in a world in which we're constantly inundated with social media messages, and then there's a 24 news cycle that corresponds with those social media messages. And according to your political leanings, you're going to be fed information based on your likes, based on the information that you gravitate towards, the news links that you click on. You're going to be fed information that feeds into your ideology and the way that you perceive the world. Mm-hmm. And what role did social media, and specifically, 24 hours, the 24-hour news cycle, cable news, Fox, MSNBC, CNN, did these entities play as you started to do your on-the-ground research in this particular region, is there any hope that another alternative message from the Democratic Party, since the Democratic Party is the party at disadvantage in this particular part of the country, is there any hope that they can break through all of these barriers that these factors have put into place to get to the people on the ground that you spoke to?
Yeah. So all of my interviewees were, largely on Facebook, but on some form of social media. Most of them also watched news, often cable news, but some didn't watch cable news. Some didn't have cable, period. Lots of people don't have cable. I don't have cable. So those things definitely matter. The argument I make in the book is that those sorts of media often lead us to polarize really rapidly on new issues that might not actually be of deep concern to us. So the example in the book is from the COVID-19 pandemic. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic was of deep concern to a lot of people, to all of us. So I don't mean to trivialize it, but here's what I do mean. So early in the COVID-19 pandemic, sort of strong Democratic and strong Republican partisans who watched, on the one hand, like MSNBC, and on the other hand, Fox News, they kind of went into their news bubbles, the way you were just talking about, and they polarized quite quickly within those news ecosystems. And by the time, so I spoke to a lot of folks right in early March 2020 as we were shutting down, as we were all really afraid and no one knew what was going on, but we were all just scared, regardless of partisanship, just scared, right? And then I spoke to them again in April, May, and then I spoke to them again in September, October, right before the election. By the time of April, May, already partisan polarization on things like masking, stay-at-home orders, all of this. By the time October came around, it was like Republicans and Democrats were living in different realities about the pandemic. Like, on the one hand, Democrats thought, that Donald Trump should be kind of imprisoned for his negligence. And on the other hand, Republicans felt like, how could a president be held accountable for the progress of a virus? Like, that's not a president's job. So you have this sense of like such extensive partisan polarization that people are living in these like different realities. And that was really startling on the one hand. But on the other hand, you have this kind of massive spectrum in between of people who either don't really live in those partisan ecosystems, they don't watch those news, or they're not really sure which of those news outlets to trust. And so they either kind of try to stay away from it, they don't form a strong opinion either direction, or they kind of try to, consume a bit of all the different news sources and come up with something like the truth, right? So the first point is that the people on these ends of the spectrum that are in these partisan ecosystems, that's not everyone. We worry about them a lot. We talk about them a lot. And we maybe should be concerned about those folks because they hold the most extreme views. And insofar as extreme views lead to extreme actions, we should be worried about that. But there's tons of people in the middle, and in both my research and in every, survey ever done, that aren't involved in that kind of like partisan bubble news watching, right? But the second thing is that even amongst those people who are in those partisan bubbles, their attention moves from this topic to the next one, right? So continuing with that example, October 2020, people are in these different realities about COVID. I went back to my field sites in August 2021 and kind of talked to people again. Where is everybody's heads at? What are we thinking about? And no one was talking about COVID. It was almost, gone from the top of mind. And the same COVID similarly had displaced people's concerns about immigration, healthcare, which had been top of mind when I first met them in summer 2019. And so often I think what these media ecosystems do is kind of like polarize the already polarized people quite intensely, but for only brief periods of time. And then they move on to the next thing. But the things that they really care about don't come from the media usually. I mean, they might be very, very passionate about that at the moment. People might be like worked up in a rage about something they've seen on the news in the moment. So I don't want to diminish the fact that they care about it. But if they're not talking about it again 6 months later, and yet they are talking about the fact that, so for example, one of my interviewees in Wisconsin was really upset about the 2017 tax cuts. And in 4 interviews over 18 months, he talked about it every single time. Like that is a core policy. And he was so concerned about it because he's just more broadly, deeply concerned about economic inequality and issues related to workers' rights. And so that policy was evidence to him of sort of the Republican Party kind of doing things that are bad for him and people like him. And so he was really focused on it as like this emblem of this is what politics is today. The Republicans represent the affluent and Democrats represent the non-affluent. And so he kept returning to it and returning to it and returning to it. And so yes, did that person get upset about various other, policies or things he saw on the news over those 18 months? Yes. But those came and went, right? And he's one of those sort of deep partisan polarized people, but he only really attached to that one flashpoint. And this was true of so many of my interviewees who had like a core narrative, a core either life experience or some political experience that resonated with their life experience, that resonated with their worldview, and it really stuck with them. And they would return to it again and again and again as we spoke. And so that kind of lived experience, which is sort of outside of the media, outside of messaging, outside of what politicians tell us, like that's really, I think, what drives people's partisan attachments. And, that's both good and bad if we're talking about overcoming partisan divisions, right? Because the thing I told you about previously, these like flashpoints of conflict, well, okay, we can overcome flashpoints of conflict. I've just told you they're not very deeply held, these opinions. So maybe we think that's easier to overcome. But if the things that are making us different politically are really kind of our whole interpretation of our life and how our life maps onto politics, that's quite difficult to overcome.
One of the things that makes this particular election unique is that there are very little folks out there who have not already formed an opinion about either of the 2 leading candidates for president of the United States. There are folks who have already come to the conclusion about how they feel about Donald Trump, how they feel about his tenure in office, how they feel about his guilt or innocence in the ongoing trial and the other trials that are to come with the 91 criminal indictments swirling over his head. And there are those who have already formed their opinion about the current incumbent president, Joe Biden. In your view, have you encountered anyone who was, I guess, quote unquote, or persuadable, anyone who could be tossed into that category of not being so entrenched in their particular side of the aisle that they're not willing to learn or adapt or change or support the other side on anything or candidate from the other party at all? And I ask this in light of the fact that you had mentioned, the news bubble industry and the role it plays, but there's also the spread of disinformation. And the reason why disinformation has become so successful is because it gives people what they want to hear. A lot of these things feed on the prejudices or biases that people already have.
Yeah, I think I certainly encountered people who are who were in 2020 undecided between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I can imagine many of them still today are undecided between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And it was in my interview sample, which is not representative of the country as a whole, but I think this is a potentially more broadly generalizable statement. It was often young people who consider themselves independents, whom this was maybe their second in 2020, maybe third election that they were voting in. And some of them their first. And so for a lot of those people, they were trying to adjudicate between, I think, these like competing versions of reality that I just described to you, sort of like, should Donald Trump go to jail because he's responsible for not the indictments you're talking about, but back in 2020 for his mishandling of the pandemic. People weren't seriously talking about putting him in jail, but a lot of people I interviewed felt that passionately about his handling of the pandemic that he was responsible for death, right? And then on the other hand, other folks who, like I said, just felt he had no responsibility for this. And so, like, if you're, 24 years old and these are the two versions you're hearing from family, from friends, or if you go onto Twitter, or if you go, try to Google something on the news, you're seeing a bunch of different headlines popping up that are telling you different things. It can be really difficult to figure out what the truth is, let alone form an opinion based on that very slippery version of truth. And so I definitely met several, it wasn't only young people, but I met several people like that over the course of the campaign. And I think, I don't know what it takes to persuade people whose kind of persuadability is linked to the fact that they don't know what the truth is, right? Like, if they knew the truth, they could form their own carefully reasoned opinions, but they don't feel they know the truth. Like, they don't feel like they can get a good grasp on it. So it's less about persuasion then and more about convincing people that you're providing like an unbiased approximation of the truth the best way you can.
And the Democratic Party has been the recipient of widespread criticism for its inability to break through demographics like those under the age of 30, like you had mentioned, young folks, young voters in America. Despite that, you still have 27 months of consecutive job growth. The stock market is doing pretty solid, and compared to other industrialized nations, we're fairly doing okay, even though we're still dealing with the inflation issue. Why is this not resonating, in your view, with people on the ground? And given the rising anxiety within the Democratic Party, what lessons can be drawn from your findings to inform campaign strategies moving forward?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll give you my guesstimate of an answer on this one, and maybe not the most optimistic answer. So one thing that I always am surprised about is that people are surprised that Americans are pessimistic about the economy. It hasn't been working for most people for a really long time. And for a while there, I think we were really aware of that fact. Post 2008 with the Occupy movement, it had been not working for people. Economic inequality had been growing for a long time prior to that. But there was a moment when we were really attuned to that. And then, I don't know, I guess we just decided everything was okay. And we lived through a pandemic, which, I think made people, even if they got stimulus checks and they built up their savings, which evidence suggests they did, that still left a lot of people feeling precarious to have lived through something like that, right? And so you come out of this years of feeling precarious on top of kind of a sense that this generation's, life outcomes, financial and economic, as well as, health and longevity outcomes might not be as good as the prior generations. And of course, people feel pessimistic. Add to that people generally think Republicans are better stewards of the economy than Democrats, for whatever bias that is. Add to that there's a partisan bias in how we evaluate the economy, right? So Democrats tend to think it does better when Democratic presidents are in office, and vice versa for Republicans. So we have a set of biases, and then we have this ground truth, which is that the economy actually sucks for a lot of people. And inflation indicators, move, but the ground truth of inequality is there. So we're often paying attention to these short-term fluctuations, waiting for them to hit on public opinion. And maybe those short-term fluctuations in public opinion are the only thing we should care about, because we think they're correlated with election outcomes in some way. But I think there's a longer term pessimism about the economy that we should be more worried about, because it's that's what's really going on in people's lives, is they're pessimistic about the economy because it doesn't work for them. And so what does that mean for the Democrats? It means that, like, you know, I feel like there's this question that people always ask about, like, how can Democrats, like, convince people that they've done a good job stewarding the economy? You can't. Like, I mean, I don't know. Listen, I don't know. Maybe you can. But how can you convince people that their lived experience is wrong? I'm saying this all the time these days, but, like, truly, how can you say to someone, you know what, your grocery bills are up, your wages haven't kept pace with the cost of living for years, maybe in the past year they have, but it still feels like things are constantly tight, you're stressed, you're exhausted, yada yada. But no, don't worry, like, things have been good the last 4 years, I promise you. Like, just trust me, things have been good for you. You can't convince somebody of that. That seems like a really silly hill to die on, personally. But I think the longer term strategy for Democrats isn't about economic messaging. It's about economic policy. And I think, you know, the Biden administration is already aware of this, and they've been doing this, investing in or implementing policies that prioritize investment in organized labor. And I think over the long term, those kinds of policies actually do shape people's lived experiences. Like, unions actually do help mitigate economic inequalities. They give people a living wage. They give people benefits. They give people the kind of security, as well as a sort of, like, political lesson about how to maintain that security. Yeah.
I remember back in the 2012 election, and during the Republican National Convention, there was a huge debt clock counting down dramatically. The previous nights before Governor Mitt Romney took the podium and accepted the party's nomination for president. And that particular debt clock was one of the iconic things that stood out to me in the 2012 presidential campaign. Here we are 12 years later, and it seems as if the national deficit is no longer a top priority for conservatives at all. In fact, you know, and I'm asking this in light of what you had just, you know, shared, the Biden administration has made it a priority to actually make comparisons with their policies in the previous administration. They've said, well, the previous administration increased the deficit by $3 trillion. Well, you don't benefit from the tax cuts that they signed in 2017. Here's what I'm doing. I haven't created X amount. You know, they've tried to draw that comparison. And I'm wondering if it rubs folks the wrong way and has the reverse effect that the administration intended for it to have. And would that strategy prove to be, I guess, a shot in the foot moving forward, where usually before the Trump era, that was just how you would play politics. President Obama seemed to be more hesitant than Biden was to toot his own horn and show off his accomplishments. Biden, of course, seems to have taken the gloves completely off, and he's ready to scrap as much as he can and make the comparisons however he can to make it resonate with voters. And I'm wondering if that has backfired in the long run.
I could see where you're coming from, given what I've just said, which is that you can't convince people that you've done a good job in making their lives better if they don't think that already. And that would be irritating. But okay, so you have to parcel the electorate down to who is anyone who would be even available for that message from Biden, right? So you have, like, the people who are already Republicans, they're going to vote for the Republican candidate, regardless of who that candidate is, most likely. And they're not going to be persuaded by Biden. Maybe they'll be irritated by that message, but they're not going to be persuaded by it. It's also just irrelevant. They're going to vote for Republicans. Then you have all the people who are going to vote for Democrats. They might be a little irritated, but they're going to vote for Democrats. Then you have your, like, persuadables. And then you have the people who may or may not turn out to vote. So the question is, like, does that message irritate the people who may or may not turn out to vote? And then the people who are persuadable. I don't know. I mean, I can see your point, but I don't think that. I think there's a way to convey some of those messages that isn't condescending or irritating, right? I think that Biden has done a lot of incredible things, particularly with respect to the climate. There's advocates who want him to do more, and advocates should advocate, and that's great. But I think he's been a remarkably productive president. He should run on his record. I think so much of the news coverage about this election has been about the economy. And I think it's for two reasons. One is because, like I said, it's a good predictor of election outcomes because it often seems to be related to that small percentage of people who don't just vote with one party or the other. And two, because it's like this puzzle, like the economy is quote unquote doing well and people don't think it's doing well. And so people are talking a lot about the economy for those two reasons. But there's other things that are going to get people out to vote and that are going to persuade people. And I think Biden has a lot to talk about there that isn't irritating, and that's important. And for some of those people who find that news cycle overwhelming and don't know what news sources to trust and don't know kind of what the truth is, like having someone get out there and say, here's what I've done, here's why it matters, here's what I will do, and here's why you can trust me to do it, that seems important to me. Maybe I'm very naive. We're so far out of my realm of expertise, but
I think a lot of folks would say the same thing. I think this election has broken so many rules already, and we're not even halfway through the year yet. But one of the things that your book covers is the advantages and disadvantages of incumbency. And I bring that up because we're in a unique situation where both candidates, really, when you look at it, are incumbents. Both of them have been in the White House for at least some time. This is the first time the nation has been deciding between two presidents since 1892, when you had Benjamin Harrison and Grover Cleveland going at it. Given both leading candidates' approval ratings and the electorate's desire for change, how both candidates leverage the advantages of incumbency while addressing the discontent?
Well, there's been this like whisper that maybe it's bad to be an incumbent right now in like industrialized democracies, that there's this like wave for change. You're smiling. Maybe you've talked to somebody about this already who knows more than I do about this. But so, I mean, if there's this anti-incumbent wave, I don't know if there is, maybe there is. We thought there was a populist wave first. A populist wave would be anti-establishment, right? That's like someone who's totally outside. So definitely not an incumbent, but that would be like the Trump vote. So the new Trump vote. Lots of people, not lots of the Trump vote was just the standard Republican vote, but maybe some of the new voters who were like, oh, that guy sounds like a guy for me. People who felt like they wanted somebody who wasn't part of the political establishment. So now there's this sense that there's a, kind of anti-incumbent wave, but I have a hunch that maybe the part of that is just an anti-establishment wave, or maybe the anti-establishment wave was also an anti-incumbent wave. People just wanted something new. People wanted change. I don't know, but I think that, it's hard to say like what one candidate or the other could do as an incumbent because they both are incumbents, right? So it's one of the few things, they're not both incumbents, but both have been president recently. And so it's one of the few things, like they both have a record that they can run on and attack each other on. But one of the things, the reality of living in a quite like crystallized partisan society is that the things that Trump would run on proudly are things that Biden would attack him on. So, the things that one person thinks are a strength, the other person thinks are their greatest liability.
That's so true. And I was specifically thinking about the overturning of Roe versus Wade when you just said that. There's so many people who this is like the selling point for their vote.
Yeah.
Whether you're not, you consider yourself pro-life or pro-choice. And we've seen that this is actually a galvanizing issue. We've seen it in 2022. We've seen it in the off-year elections. The excitement and the fervor behind that issue doesn't seem to have died down. In fact, as we're approaching this election, this is going to be the first election since 1972 where Roe versus Wade was not the law of the land. And this is going to be, it seems, one of the determining factors. And it's so much an influential factor that you have Trump himself kind of trying to dial back some of the statements that he said publicly, while the Biden administration is trying to put him on full blast and say, no, you said this on the record. This is what he said. He said that he is responsible for overturning Roe versus Wade. He appointed these 3 justices that brought you the overturning of this decision. And while that's going on, you have folks also entertaining the idea of third-party candidates, specifically the candidacy of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. How do minor candidates, and I know we've been down this road before in 2016, when a lot of folks were complaining that both leading candidates are unpopular, and they're now looking for the Libertarian candidate, or they're looking for the Green Party candidate, or looking for the Constitution Party candidate. How do minority candidates impact the strategies of major party candidates in a closely contested election? And what should the Biden campaign do, in your view, to minimize the influence of these candidates on his voter base? There are a lot of discussion that Robert Kennedy is pulling votes from Donald Trump. You had Donald Trump attending the Libertarian Party convention and getting booed recently. And he said, well, go ahead and keep getting your 3% if you don't want to join with me and run as a unified party with the Republicans and Libertarians together and arm in arm. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, those kinds of small parties keep me awake at night, because I'm sure they keep the Biden campaign awake at night. I mean, RFK Jr. keeps me awake at night in Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. I think particularly with those, I can really just imagine the constituency that would vote for him and not Joe Biden in those core states. And that, I can see why quiet would keep pollsters awake at night. Yeah, I'm not sure what you do about those kind of candidates except try to convince people to be strategic about their vote. I mean, I don't think Americans are strategic about their vote. Otherwise, people wouldn't vote as much as they do. I know we don't vote enough, maybe some people would say in this country, but I think for the most part, people don't think that way. They vote with their party, right? And so the people who are going to vote for those small third parties are often independents or undecided, people who don't have a strong party attachment to begin with, or maybe people who've been Democrats their whole life and they're becoming disaffiliated with the party and they're looking for something different, or who've been Republicans their whole life and they're looking for something different. Those are the people who are going to be available for third-party voting, and I don't know how you bring them back into the fold. We're way beyond things I know about. I'm really guessing at this point.
A lot of political talking heads and pundits have characterized the American public's attitudes as negative, angry, pessimistic, tired, exhausted. Is that what you saw in the course of your research in the Midwest? Were people angry, or were they at least somewhat hopeful that they could get the policies that they want? Although this may not be an election where anyone fell in love necessarily with their respective candidate, did you see that folks had a little bit of optimism about what could be the trajectory of the next 4 years And then maybe in 28, they find the candidate that they fall in love with.
Yeah. So I think that there's a lot of variation in the kinds of communities that I studied in my book. That's sort of, what the whole book is about, right? That I think we often think about the Midwest or Midwestern battleground states or post-industrial cities as kind of this monolith, this group of places that were once democratic and no longer are, and they're not democratic anymore because, like you said, they're angry and discontented, and they want to vote for candidates who speak to that anger and discontentment. But that's not true of most of the people that I met. It was really only true amongst some people in one community that I studied in Minnesota. And, in that community, they'd lost their largest employer a couple decades ago. The population has decreased in size by about 20% in the last 40 years. They've just experienced a lot of loss, and people are worried that the town is actually like on the verge of extinction. It's not. There's still 18,000 or so folks who live there. But it feels that way to people. They've seen like so much of the social fabric of the community disintegrate around them. Churches are declining in membership. Unions are no longer the force they once were. And so much of civic and economic life has really totally transformed. And it makes people feel that precarity that I was talking about before, that kind of a strong breeze could blow the whole town over. And so when you start having politicians that say things like, what would really destroy your way of life is more immigration. Who wants more immigration? The Democrats. And you know what Democrats are going to do? They're going to give immigrants a bunch of welfare and a bunch of assistance that they never gave you and that no one would ever give you. And so if you vote for Democrats, they're just going to focus on, all of that and leave you to continue suffering here. And so those messages really resonate in those places. Those folks do feel, I think, in that community, some folks, not all folks, but some folks in that community certainly feel that something really precious has been lost and even more could be lost. And what it would look like if even more were lost is really scary to them. And certainly they sometimes are angry, but they're often like sorrowful about that loss. But again, not everyone is angry, not everyone is resentful, not everyone is sorrowful. I mean, I think for the most part, people are resilient, and a lot of these communities that we tend to paint with these broad brushstrokes, those communities are resilient. And so they found new ways of making things work in a sort of post-industrial 21st century economy and society that allows people to feel like they have kind of meaningful employment and like a meaningful place in society and in politics. And so it was really just in that one city where I kind of heard that kind of anger and sorrow and sense of loss bubbling up.
Now, one of the things that are interesting about this election is that immigration, like you had mentioned, is a key factor. You had the House of Representatives vote on this immigration bill that Senator James Langford, Senator of Oklahoma, crafted. You had the Senate not pass the bill. Now, this bill, I always say, was evidence of the fact that the Republican Party won on the issue of immigration. They've convinced the American people that this is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, that the Democrats have been sleeping at the wheel on this issue, and the Democrats actually were going to vote on this bill. They were going to vote on a bill in which they were getting far less than the conservatives were going to get, and yet Donald Trump called for his allies in Congress not to put their support behind this bill, just so that this administration wouldn't get a win. Despite that, their characterization of the Democrats being weak on immigration is still out there, like you mentioned. folks seem to have grabbed onto a narrative that seemed to have been expired, and they're not letting it go. And I could say the same about other issues, whether it's fighting for freedom abroad. Democrats have been strong advocates for Ukraine, while Republicans have been dragging their feet on it, and ironically attached the border bill security funding to that bill, only for the Democrats to say, fine, we'll vote on it. And then they said, well, never mind. And it took months before we actually saw a bill come out of the Congress that would support Ukraine. Democrats have put their support behind gun control, which a majority of Americans seem to agree with, climate change, which young people specifically resonate with. Why is it that the old narratives of yesteryear, the old narratives of pre-2024 are still determining the way folks are making decisions in the present?
Yeah. I think this goes back to one of your earlier questions. You talked about these national narratives. But what I talk a lot about in my book, and what I think is true about a lot of politics, are these more personal narratives, often informed, by where people live, who they're friends with, what they do for work. And those narratives tell you they help you make sense of your life, and also sort of the parties and which party is best going to represent you and your needs and other people like you. Those narratives don't come from the parties, and they probably don't come from one policy in Congress or even a slate of policies in Congress, right? And so I kind of told you before the story of this Wisconsin city that I studied, where sort of in this town, because organized labor is still so politically active, a lot of residents still think of the Democrats as, the party representing a broad group of folks who are disadvantaged in an unequal system, right? And there was one woman I interviewed, she was 94. She lived through the Great Depression. She was like, it's like FDR, the Democrats represent the man on the streets. And so that view of the party persists, not just in someone who was there when FDR was president, but in the younger generations in this town, right? But in that other town in Indiana I was telling you about, where there's all those socially engaged churches, people there think of the parties not divided along these lines of class and inequality, but they think about them divided around issues of Christian morality. They also think about the parties divided along lines of sort of like how much federal government intervention they'll support. So people in these two cities would agree on that piece. But in the Republican city, they think not that the Democrats are going to bring in the government to help the people who are struggling. They think, they think they're going to bring in the federal government to like overwhelm communities like theirs, when communities like theirs are already taking care of the people who are struggling, right? So they think of the Republican Party as the party that will respect Christian values and biblical principles, but also respect communities wanting to take care of their own. And so those narratives that come from kind of like our lived experiences, where we live, who we know, that tell us sort of what politics is about and where I fit into politics, those narratives are much deeper and more enduring than the kinds of narratives that you're talking about that come out of Congress or that come out of Politico or wherever narratives come from, or come from Chuck Schumer or whoever, and so it's kind of like what I said before. You can't convince somebody that the Democrats have made, like, are good stewards of the economy and they should be grateful if they feel like they're struggling right now. You also can't convince someone that the Democrats are, or that the Republicans are, the party of like Satan, if they think that Republicans are the party of Christian morality.
One of the things that a lot of political experts say is that the Republican Party is forever changing. They're not going back to the likes of John McCain. They're not going back to George W. Bush, Mitt Romney. They're forever sold on this MAGA Trump party. Now, in your research, it seems as if you have some, as you expressed, folks are sorrowful about the condition of politics in the present day. Does that necessarily translate to a longing for the way things used to be, where the Republican Party was not so extreme, where folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene were not at the forefront, but necessarily, folks that, would be hidden because they brought down the party. They were an embarrassment and they were not considered serious policymakers. Is there a desire to return to the days where everyone could accept an election defeat or victory, and not say that it's rigged, and want to inspire discontent and a lack of faith in the way our elections are conducted in this country? Do you believe that it's possible to, say, have a Republican nominee for president who falls in alignment with Elizabeth Cheney or Adam Kinzinger or John McCain?
Yeah. So I don't think we can say anything about the Republican Party having forever changed. In general, political change in this country, because we're in a two-party system, it tends to happen within the parties. And so we don't really observe large-scale successful third-party movements kind of emerging and taking up a sort of left or right flank. That doesn't happen. So instead, those left or right flanks, or maybe they're orthogonal to a left-right political dimension, but just a sort of a new flank of politics tends to emerge and sort of jockey for power within the party, right? And so that means that for social movements and interest groups and people out there who want to organize and gain political representation, they only have two options. They have the Democrats and they have the Republicans. So that means that the Republicans are basically, as are the Democrats, under constant pressure to change. And it might not appear that way. The change might look really slow as we're living through it. But when you look back historically, there have been sort of long-term, tides of, evolution within each party over decades. And so we shouldn't expect that this is the end all be all of the Republican Party. And in fact, there's this book chapter written in 1967 arguing that the parties in Western industrialized democracies had frozen after the Industrial Revolution, that sort of class cleavages and in industrialized society were sort of the end all be all of party politics. And they wrote that in 1967, sort of, right after the civil rights movement in the US, the height of new social movements across the US and Europe. And they just fully missed sort of this tidal wave of political change. And so you just have things, has the Republican Party kind of stopped where it is? Definitely not. Do I know where it's going? Also no. And then your other question about, did any of my interviewees kind of have a longing for a past age of maybe greater political civility and greater seriousness? I do think that, there was, before I went into the field for this book, I started the field work in 2019, and there was a lot of commentary, I guess, or maybe, political observation saying that, something about Trump's pugilistic style, his way of fighting for people, his tone of voice, that really appealed to his quote unquote base. And actually, a lot of what I found in my interviewees, even amongst sort of very recent converts to the right, so people who voted, Trump was the first Republican they've ever voted for, they didn't like that so much. What they liked was someone that seemed to be, as I said before, speaking to an experience of loss and fear that they were having. And so they were also voting for other Republicans who were speaking to them in those ways, right? So it wasn't just Trump. And a lot of people, I think, were, during the course of my fieldwork, pretty exhausted. People who, if you think about the two groups I described to you before, on the one hand, the people who are in their partisan news bubbles, and on the other hand, the people who are trying to, average the left and the right to get to some form of medium truth, and then the people who can't figure out how to average the left and the right, that's exhausting for everybody. It's exhausting to watch news where people are yelling at each other all the time. And it's exhausting to have to try to figure out what the truth is, because all the news is biased to one side or the other, and it's loud and it's obnoxious. And so I think loads of people by the end of the 2020 presidential campaign were exhausted by national politics, and they wanted nothing more to do with it. They wanted it to be over. And people described a feeling of like, Democrats in particular who I interviewed had a feeling of like, okay, I can take a deep breath and stop watching so much news. I don't want to watch news like this anymore. It was really troubling, really upsetting to me.
And in that same vein, there seems to be a fever of isolationism, particularly on the right, as we're talking about Ukraine aid, not as it pertains to Israel, but particularly Ukraine. Did you see that on the ground in the Midwest, where folks are saying, well, what about me, right? I can't afford gasoline. I can't afford groceries. Why are we prioritizing another country's national defense? And I'm still struggling to make it to the end of the month. This, I guess, lack of an understanding or appreciation for why we have to invest in countries like Ukraine for our own national security.
Yeah.
Why it was important.
So I certainly think that people felt that way about some people. Again, not everyone. Some people felt that way about immigration, in terms of helping newcomers at their expense, that they felt like the country was too full and was kind of giving away a fixed set of resources. So the slices of pie were getting smaller and smaller. That was a perception that some people had. But I was not doing field work by the time of the Ukraine war. So I'm not sure how folks are feeling about that these days.
And last, before I let you go,
Okay.
With Trump's ongoing legal battles, do you because you started this project in 2019 when the first impeachment process was still going on, and that, of course, was over whether or not Trump put pressure on Zelensky for future aid. We seem to be a world apart from those days, even though that was just a few short years ago. But with Trump's ongoing legal battles, do you believe that every time the Biden administration, alludes to those legal battles, that every time a Democratic strategist or candidate makes the contrast and says, well, one candidate is being accused of, you fill in the blank, with the 91 criminal charges over his head, and our candidate is more of a workhorse, he's more progressive. Do you see that as turning folks off and having an opposite intended effect, like we discussed earlier, or is it effective? Are people saying, this is not normal, and I want Trump to just be a normal guy and just to get my policies done, but I just can't get past the fact that I'm being asked to vote for a candidate who might be indicted?
Yeah, I mean, I think that people. So during the impeachment, I think most people, so Democrats took that very seriously, as we can imagine, and hoped for his impeachment. Republicans did not take it very seriously. And honestly, amongst the interviewees that I spoke to who were not strong partisans one way or the other, a lot of people kind of lumped it all under one of two buckets. One bucket is politicians in general are corrupt and do corrupt things. And so this is unsurprising. And any politician, if we went into their closet, we would find something. Or they lumped it under, Trump is always blurring lines. How is this different from any of the other stuff that he does? And I just don't want to deal with the circus. So neither of those responses suggests that the criminal proceedings now would be massively impactful amongst those kind of not strong partisans. But the people I spoke to aren't kind of representative of the whole country. And I'm sure there are people for whom the indictments are deeply troubling. I don't know those people.
Professor Ternullo, this has been a fascinating discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And again, the name of the book is How the Heartland Went Red. It just came out in April. Wonderful read, and I would recommend it to anyone who's watching the program or going back to watch it. Please, it's an excellent read, and it helps us understand what the other part of the country is thinking. For those who've only spent their entire life on either side of the coasts, this was a wonderful and educational read, and I thoroughly enjoyed speaking about this book with you, Professor. Thank you so much for what you brought to the table.
Thanks for having me.
With that being said, that's going to conclude this episode of the Political Mike podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Hi, it's Mike Taylor, the host of the Political Mike podcast. If you like what you heard tonight, I want to invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I also want to ask you to please follow along on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, and Amazon Music. You can also follow along and keep up with the conversation through our Telegram channel. Follow us on Twitter at @ThePolyMike, and follow us on Instagram. Thank you so much, and no matter what part of the political spectrum that you fall on, I want to encourage you to stay engaged, stay a part of the conversation, and stay informed. Thank you.